Greetings. Welcome to another edition of Squaring the Circle podcast. I'm your host, Randall Carlson. In this episode, we are going to be looking at some of the symbolism and traditions associated in ancient times with cosmic impacts and their effects on Earth and civilization. When I was quite a bit younger, back in the 70s, I attempted to read, and I did read most of a two-volume set by H.P. Blavatsky called The Secret Doctrine. I was very interested in anything that had to do with the mysteries of our own existence on this planet, spiritual traditions, hidden things, all of that. One of the quotes that jumped out at me when I was reading in there, and it's a very massive volume tome, but the one thing I do remember was a quote that I wrote down, and we're going to begin with that. I never tire of this quote by the famous historian Will Durant, who said in the summation of a lifetime of studying the history of civilization on Earth, he said, civilization exists by geological consent, subject to change without notice. I think that this is an insight into the nature of our efforts to create civilization on this planet that needs to be taken into account. But it's generally been sidelined in most of the popular culture and in the issues that concern people. And I refer specifically there to the concerns about anthropogenic climate change, about which I have talked in depth and will continue to present information on that to try to put that whole controversy into some kind of a rational perspective. Frederick Soddy, the Nobel Prize-winning chemist who passed away in 1956, said this: "The legend of the fall of man, possibly, may be all that has survived of such a time before when, for some unknown reason, the whole world was plunged back again under the undisputed sway of nature to begin once more its upward, toilsome journey through the ages." Now, what has happened since he made this quote is we know a lot more about our own catastrophic history on this planet. And we have some pretty good ideas about what those reasons were for the fall of civilization. That's one of the big topics that we explore in this particular podcast, and it's one of the major topics that has been the subject of this series that I've been doing on apocalyptic traditions, ancient and modern. An old English proverb says that fire and water have no mercy. And that, I think, harkens back to the knowledge that fire and water have been the two primary agencies of global catastrophes that have come down to us in the traditions of apocalypse. You'll note that the Bible begins after the expulsion from the Garden of Eden and the generations of the patriarchs. 10th patriarch Noah survives a great deluge, a world-destroying deluge, a destruction of the world by water, and that tradition has echoes through many dozens of cultures that have preserved traditions about gigantic floods and deluges. Cataclysmos was the Greek term for destruction of the world by fire, by water, from which we get the term cataclysm, which specifically refers to world destruction, a watery destruction of the world. We now know from the studies of paleohydrology that gigantic, unimaginably gigantic floods have really occurred in the recent geological history of this planet. Likewise, the term ekperousis, the Greek term for the destruction of the world by fire. We now know that fire has also been an agency of world destruction, and that has been demonstrated because we can find the fingerprints of ancient gigantic fires in things like the core samples taken from the bottom of lakes, from core samples taken from ice cores in Greenland and other ice sheets around the world. And some of these conflagrations have been extraordinarily huge. And survivors of some of these that we're talking about here and will be talking about could easily believe that they were destroying the world as a whole. So let's continue on then with the testimony of history and the language of symbolism. So here is the quote from H.P. Blavatsky from The Secret Doctrine, Volume 2, Anthropogenesis, published in 1888. And this was the quote that intrigued me so much that it sort of helped to stimulate curiosity about the things that she was talking about here. So she raises some questions. So let's read. The modern archaeologist, though speculating ad infinitum upon the dolmens and their builders, knows in fact nothing of them or their origin, and that still is as true today as it was in 1888. Yet these weird and often colossal monuments of unhewn stones, which consist generally of 4 or 7 gigantic blocks placed together, are strewn over Asia, Europe, America, and Africa in groups or rows. There is no country from which they are absent. Who built them? Why are they all connected with serpents and dragons? So here's an example of what we mean by a dolmen. And you can see here it's just a series of blocks, and there's hundreds of them. And what was their purpose? Well, to this, modern archaeologists really don't know. They said, well, it had a religious or a ceremonial purpose, and that's about as far as it goes. I would suggest that what we're actually looking here is remnants of an ancient technology. Now, that's not going to be the subject of this episode of Squaring the Circle, but it is going to be a theme and a subject that we explore in much greater depth in upcoming episodes. So keep that in mind as we go forward here when I say technology, and why an important hint or clue here is the association with dragons, right? Now, dragons are a very powerful and potent symbol that we find all over the world, from China all the way down to Mexico and amongst Native Americans. Dragons, or their counterpart, serpents, or sometimes fire serpents. So let's continue on here with this. I love some of the modern depictions of dragons. We see this great fierce beast mounted on a pinnacle, presumably, notice the wings, because dragons could fly. And for all enthusiasts of the Lord of the Rings and the stories of the J.R.R. Tolkien, many people know that dragons usually hibernate in caves. And so dragons have this twofold existence. They can exist underground or they can exist in the sky. And the symbolical meaning of the dragon is indicated by that dual existence of both terrestrial and celestial. Keep that in mind. And as we go forward and we start looking at this material, if you have an opportunity to grab a notebook and a pen, I highly recommend taking some notes, particularly when we get into the specifics of the symbolism that we associate now with cosmic events. Okay, so let's proceed. Now, this is from a book that I read years ago, Thunderstorms, Stones and Shooting Stars, Meteors and Meteorites in Folklore. In legends of Central Asia, meteors were fire serpents coursing across the sky. Sometimes these serpents brought problems, and sometimes they brought hordes of treasure and riches. To the folks from the Andaman Islands, meteors were torches carried by evil spirits of the forest as they hunted for men. Okay, fire serpents. Right here we see explicitly the association between serpents and, even more precisely fire serpents with the idea of meteors. Also, we see that we got, it's as mentioned here, brought problems. Okay. Sometimes they could create problems. Sometimes they could bring hordes of treasure and riches. Now, we're not going to be exploring that in this particular episode, but we now know that some of the most richest precious metals and ore-bearing strata on Earth are associated with cosmic impact, such as Sudbury, Astrobleme in Ontario, Vredefort in South Africa, and others we're discovering. In fact, when Pemex, which was Petroleum Mexico, was searching for hydrocarbons, they drilled into, this is back in the 80s, they drilled into the Cretaceous Tertiary Astrobleme, which is called Chicxulub, because they thought that would be a very logical place for there to be a hydrocarbon deposit. So even right there, we have an example of exploratory drilling, looking for hydrocarbons and drilling into what they, at the time, they didn't know was an astrobleme, but later was confirmed to be, in fact, impact produced. NASA has on their website, they have a really good summation of comets in ancient cultures and some of the reactions and impressions of comets, comet impacts, and so on. And so I'm going to recite from that because it has a lot of good condensed information. It's understandable by a layperson. It doesn't get too technical, but it also covers some of the more prevalent symbolism associated with comets, asteroids, meteors, fireballs, shooting stars, impacts, and so on. So we'll just go through that together. And here we go. Comets have inspired dread, fear, and awe in many different cultures and societies around the world and throughout time. They have been branded with such titles as the harbinger of doom and the menace of the universe. They have been regarded both as omens of disaster and messengers of the gods. Why is it that comets are some of the most feared and venerated objects in the night sky? Why did so many cultures cringe at the sight of a comet? Well, I think every year that goes by, we're, finding out more and more what the answer to those questions actually would be. Is that because of comets and their spring that result through the disintegration of comets, Earth has suffered numerous catastrophes, far more than just the single object that wiped out the dinosaurs. What were the gods trying to say? Some cultures read the message by the images that they saw upon looking at the comet. For example, to some cultures, the tail of the comet gave it the appearance of the head of a woman with long flowing hair behind her. And I will mention that the word cometa or cometa literally means long-haired. Okay, so there's another symbol. If you're taking notes, we've got fire serpents, we've got torches, and now we've got long hair. Okay, this sorrowful symbol of mourning was understood to mean the gods that had sent the comet to Earth were displeased. All right, and this interesting sorrowful symbol of mourning is one we're going to look at again later. It has a very important role to play in deciphering Masonic symbolism. So we'll come back to that. Others thought that the elongated comet looked like a fiery sword blazing across the night sky, a traditional sign of war and death. Such a message from the gods could only mean that their wrath would soon be unleashed onto the people of the land. Such ideas struck fear into those who saw comets dart across the sky. The likeness of the comet, though, was not the only thing that inspired fear. Ancient cultural legends also played a hand in inspiring a terrible dread of these celestial nomads. The Roman prophecies, the Sibylline oracles, spoke of, quote, a great conflagration from the sky falling to earth. While the most ancient known mythology, the Babylonian Epic of Gilgamesh, described fire, brimstone, and flood with the arrival of a comet. Now, I think we can make a scientific case that Epic of Gilgamesh was perhaps ahead of its time, because all of these things that were associated in the Epic of Gilgamesh with comets, we now know, we can scientifically demonstrate, are in fact associated with the arrival of comets into an Earth-crossing orbit. Rabbi Moses ben Nachman, a Jew living in Spain, wrote of God taking 2 stars from Chema and throwing them at the earth in order to begin the great flood. Now let's pause for a minute there. 2 stars from Chema. Again, I hate to keep putting things off. We are going to come back to that, because this is a really important clue that ties into understanding the whole process of global catastrophe associated with the Younger Dryas and the Younger Dryas potential impact event. Yakut legend in ancient Mongolia called comets the daughter of the devil, and warned of destruction, storm, and frost whenever she approaches the earth. Stories associating comets with such terrible imagery are at the base of so many cultures on earth and fuel a dread that followed comet sightings throughout history. Well, I would say that this dread and fear of comets has roots in very real memories and experiences of ancient people. And, of course, I think modern science is confirming that. Although we still seem to be more neglectful of that interpretation or that insight than we ought to be, given what we now know. So unlike their Western counterparts, Chinese astronomers kept extensive records on the appearances, paths, and disappearances of hundreds of comets. Extensive comet atlases have been found dating back to the Han Dynasty, which described comets as long-tailed pheasant stars or broom stars, and associate the different cometary forms with different disasters. You can add now to your list, if you hopefully took my advice, you paused the video, you went and got yourself a notebook and a pen, or you're doing it digitally, however you're doing it, and you're taking notes. And you're listing these things, because this is the vocabulary of ancient symbolism. These are the words that are associated into phrases by which we can then interpret and understand a lot of the ancient symbolism, okay? So broom stars, add that to the list. Broom stars, we'll continue, we'll come back to this in just a moment here, this symbolism of the broom star. Although most human beings no longer cringe at the sight of a comet, well, yes, because it's been a long time since we've had, at least in modern historical memory, that we have an awareness or a remembrance of a cometary-induced disaster. However, go back and listen to the episodes within this Apocalypse series on the Tunguska event of 1908. I highly recommend re-listening to that, because there are so many lessons to be extracted from that particular event for the survival of our modern civilization. So, although most human beings no longer cringe at the sight of a comet, they still inspire fear everywhere around the globe, from Hollywood to doomsday cults. I think that doomsday cults is probably a reference to the when Comet Hale-Bopp flew by, and that one particular cult, whose name escapes me at the moment, committed mass suicide, believing that they were going to hitch a ride on the comet. I don't know how that worked out for them, but I suspect that they might have been misled somewhere along the way. The United States even set up the Near-Earth Asteroid Tracking, or NEAT, program specifically to guard us from these divine dangers. However, although they were once regarded as omens of disaster, and messengers of the gods. Today, scientific approach has helped allay such concerns. It is science and reason that has led the fight against this fear since the days of the ancients. It is science and reason that has emboldened the human spirit enough to venture out and journey, literally journey to a comet. It is science and reason that will unlock the secrets that they hold. Now, I concur with all of the sentiments of that last paragraph, but I will say that the fear since the days of the ancients was not unfounded. And I think that science and reason is, in fact, confirming that truth. And there are secrets to be unlocked from comets, and we have a lot more to learn, but there's a lot that has been learned that we need to take notice of, and that's part of my motivation for doing this particular series in Squaring the Circle. This was from the journal Science and Christian Belief by the author Colin Humphreys, published in 1995, specifically about the Star of Bethlehem, which, of course, was the star that guided the three wise men to the Nativity. So in that article, he mentions that the Chinese kept careful astronomical records of visible comets, nova, etc., and used different terms to describe them. A tailed comet was called Sui Xing, meaning a broom star, the broom referring to the tail of a comet, right? And the noted Chinese astronomer Li Shun Feng has this to say on the subject of broom stars. Comets are vile stars. Every time they appear in the south, something happens to wipe out the old and establish the new. And when we see some of the great comets in the sky, we can see how the metaphor of a broom came to be applied to the appearance of comets. From Mary Proctor, a very readable book that delves into a lot of the ancient symbolism associated with comets. The Romance of Comets, published way back in 1926. Quoting from her book, comets are called broom stars in China, a name derived from the form of their tails, which have the very prosaic name of brooms. And the idea was that as a broom sweeps out the dirt and the debris and the dust of the old, cleans out the room, the floor, whatever, for the onset of the new, that comets also served in that role. We've already seen this quote, but it's good to revisit the question, who built them and why are they all connected with serpents and dragons? Well, again, keep in mind the dual nature of the dragon, both terrestrial and celestial, because that's an important clue. Okay, so now this is from study of comets in Islamic astronomy and astrology from the Journal of Near Eastern Studies, published back in 1957 by Orientalist E.S. Kennedy, one of the most respected Orientalists publishing back during that period. The Ibn Hibinte. So, a Christian astrologer of Baghdad, this individual in 829 wrote an astrological work called El-Maghini. A copy of the second part is in the Bardeschi Staatsbibliothek in Munich. On folio 67 of this document, there begins a section entitled, On the Stars Having Tails. The passage states that there are 7 such stars in the heaven or sphere of the sun, surrounding it after the fashion of stars. Surrounding it. It's a little typo there. Surrounding it after the fashion of stars. The manuscript names 5 of these. Okay, so Tefur is the Arabic name, and it says here, reference the comet name Typhon. Now we're going to come back to the Typhon here in a second. Izak is a Persian loan word in Arabic meaning a short spear, hence a meteor. So add this now. Typhon, in the myth of Marduk battling Typhon in this great celestial battle, and Marduk finally defeats Typhon. But then we have the Persian word, which also means a spear, because this is another one of the images that was projected onto shooting stars, comets, asteroid phenomena that was visible, fireballs in the sky, and so on. Then Alesa, meaning the stick, Dur al-Lehya, the bearded one, and then finally Duh al-Khwasa, the hunchback. So you can add these to the list now of various images and symbols associated with celestial phenomena. Okay, let's go on. These are some of the historical accounts of what from eyewitnesses of these kinds of celestial phenomena. This is from the history of Japan. I'm not going to try to probably Engelbert Kempfer, MD, translated by J.G. Schuser of London, 1728. Now, this is referring to events in the reign of Sinon, which began in 29 BC. So in the 36th year of his reign, it rained stars from heaven in Japan. In the 40th year of his reign, on a clear and serene day, there arose of a sudden in China a violent storm of thunder and lightning. Comets, fiery dragons, and uncommon meteors appeared in the airs, and it rained fire from heaven. Now, this is why I'm going to be highly recommending that you go back and re-listen to the episodes specifically about Tunguska. The Tunguska event of June 30th, 1908, is probably the preeminent, most prominent cosmic lesson that humans can learn about our relationship to the earth and to the sky and our ancient ancestors' beliefs and experiences with these same phenomena. Notice here several things. Let's take note here. A violent storm of thunder and lightning. Well, we know that this was associated with Tunguska, absolutely. There was experienced, many people interpreted what they experienced as being a violent storm. And we have fiery dragons, uncommon meteors, and then we have specifically saying it rained fire from the sky. Does that mean that it triggered terrestrial fires? I don't know. They're not specific enough. But this idea of fire from the sky is one that is repeated over and over again in the traditions of olden times. Now going back to Mary Proctor. Comets have sometimes been pictured as dragons, and according to Pliny, the shape of a comet indicated its character as a portent. Thus, some were shown as arrowheads, sea monsters, swords, lances, and flames. In AD 69, according to Josephus, several signs appeared in the sky announcing the destruction of Jerusalem. And this is quoting from Josephus. Amongst other warnings, a comet, one of the kind called Ziphius, because their tails appear to represent the blade of a sword, was seen above the city for the space of a whole year. So now we can add this, the blade of a sword, right? A spear, a fire serpent, a torch, okay? Arrowheads, lances, all of these have been very frequently associated with the kinds of phenomena we're talking about here. So rather than explicitly describing these experiences in terminology that we would recognize from a scientific perspective, they had their own symbology. And once we understand the symbology and the meaning, we can go back and we can review a lot of the ancient writings, the ancient prophetic writings, and so on, and see them in a whole new context. And that's exactly where we're going with this section of Squaring the Circle podcasts on the traditions of apocalypse. This is from a European chronicle set down around 1000 AD. We also quoted in Proctor and in Sagan. That's the Carl Sagan's work on comets. The heavens having opened. I want you to notice this now. This is again back in 1000 AD from a chronicle back then, and describing the heavens as opening. Okay. The heavens having opened, a kind of burning torch fell upon the earth, leaving behind it a long train of light similar to a flash of lightning. Okay. Here's where we can begin to see the correlation. Also, we know from fireballs and impacts and meteors, there can frequently be electromagnetic phenomena associated with them that manifest as lightning. Such was its light that it frightened not only those who were in the open country, but those who were within doors. As this opening in the heavens slowly closed, men saw with horror the figure of a dragon, whose feet were blue and whose head seemed continually to increase. Now, of course, that would make perfect sense if the comet is approaching, and the nearer it gets, the greater the nucleus now appears in the sky. So it's also probable that this comet was associated with an entourage of debris, which we now know can be the case with a lot of comets. There may be a main nucleus, but then there may be, say, satellite material that's associated with it. Some of this may directly impact the Earth, where the nucleus itself doesn't fall to Earth. But this is very interesting, this idea of the opening of the heavens and then closing again, and the figure of a dragon. So here's contributions towards the history of the star showers in former times, written by Edward C. Herrick, published in the Meteorological Journal back in 1841, and he had collected a lot of these ancient accounts that he included in this work of his. So AD 764. In the same year, in the month of March, stars were seen falling from heaven so that all the beholders imagined that the end of the world had come. There was also a great drought, and the fountains were dried up. Now, this idea that took hold of so many of the eyewitnesses and those who experienced these events was clearly apocalyptic. Over and over again, we see that in some of these grander scale events, the witnesses thought, this is it. This is the end of the world, right? They certainly believed that with regard to the Tunguska event, but many others as well. And this also, now, from the naturalistic perspective, we find these interesting correlations. We learned from the accounts of Tunguska that, and we know from the scientific evidence, that there was an earthquake, a relatively strong earthquake that was felt, right? But now the first impression would be most scientists would dismiss any correlation or connection between things terrestrially and things celestially, like the nearby visitation of a comet, right? I would say that that might be premature. We should consider that there may very well be correlations and links between what goes on out there and what goes on down here below. Problem is, too many scientists, as gatekeepers of the rational and the establishment view of things, are too ready to dismiss astrology. Now, of course, they're dismissing astrology in its modern degenerate forms, but because they do that, they don't realize that the origins of astrology had their roots in the correlations between what happened in the sky and what happened in the earth. And now we can make a pretty strong case that, yes, there is this pattern of interaction between earth and sky. And it's not just based upon some silly superstition or some new age fad, but actually has real world roots. And that's, again, will be a theme that we're going to be exploring much greater detail. The possibility that out there, what happens out there might actually be affecting things like droughts and other things as well. So this was from the Stephanus Chronographia, the history of Byzantium. If you want to take notes and actually dive into this yourself, I think you'll be able to use some of these references and go into Google Scholar and maybe even find some of the original stuff. Now, most of this I've collected 10 and 20 years ago. There's even more now available than there was back then. Okay, this is from an Arabic paper, and this was quoted. This guy, M. Fran La Institutes, that would be French. This was what happened in AD 899, November 14th, which possibly puts it very close to being, if the modern dates, if they're using our modern calendar, this puts it right during the Leonid meteor shower. In the year 286 of the Hegira, there was an earthquake in Egypt. On Wednesday, the 7th of the month, I won't even try to pronounce that, from midnight until morning, and stars called Shuhab, or luminous meteors, were in extraordinary commotion, going from east to west and from north to south in such a manner that no mortal could look at the heavens. Now, right here, this is interesting. Okay, an earthquake. There was an earthquake on Wednesday, the 7th of the month, and then from midnight until morning, the stars called Shuhab were in extraordinary commotion, probably falling to Earth. Now, is it possible that there was atmospheric detonations, as we found in Tunguska, that was associated with an earthquake? Why not? I mean, otherwise it's just simply a coincidence. But what I'm proposing here is that when we look at the traditional accounts that have come down to us, we find these correlations in such abundance that it becomes hard to dismiss all of them as being merely coincidence. And we know from the lessons that we've learned from Tunguska that, yes, that a cosmic impact, even if it's an aerial detonation or an aerial bombardment, can be associated with an earthquake, okay? So this is not at all stretching it to think that here this event is talking about a phenomena where earthquake and, meteors, bolides, being the collective term, are associated. Okay, notes found on a calendar and printed at the end of the Chronicon Cavensi, Muratori. So this is Italian. Anyways, AD 931 or 934. In the same year appeared signs in the heavens among the stars, which appeared, some falling, others blazing like torches, the 14th day of October, the second day of the moon. So here again now, torches, right? Now this is completely disconnected cultural experience than what we referred to earlier, but we find disparate cultures projecting the same type of symbolism here, in this case, torches. AD 55, on October 17th, this year there was a fall of stars during the night preceding the first day of the month, Jomadi, or Hegira 241, which continued from the beginning of the night until dawn. At the same period, earthquakes were felt in all parts of the world. Again, are we looking at a coincidence here? Or are we looking at a unified phenomena? That the fall of these stars from the heavens and the terrestrial response in the form of seismic shaking or earthquakes, that they're part of the same event. I think we need to be seriously considering that, and to reiterate, this is one of the things, the important lessons, takeaway lessons from the Tunguska cosmic lesson. Okay? AD 935, in the year 323, several violent shocks of an earthquake were felt in Egypt, the third day of Dhul Qa'dah. At about the same time, many of those meteors called falling stars of a very remarkable kind likewise appeared in Egypt. I would like to mention that one of our original sponsors at Cosmographia, CBD from the Gods, is following us here to our new podcast, Squaring the Circle. As many of you know, I've been using their products for going on 4 years now, and having tried a number of CBD brands, CBD from the Gods seems the most effective for my needs, which is primarily as a sleep aid and as a remedy for inflammation and associated pain. I use both the oil and the salve. My wife also likes their products, especially the salve, which alleviates the pain in her hands, which is the result of working for years as an electrician. If you've been thinking about trying a CBD product and experiencing the benefits for yourself, give CBD from the Gods a try. To learn more and see their product line, check out cbdfromthegods.com. Any purchase of their products helps our efforts here at Squaring the Circle to realize our goal of making this world a better place. Thanks. So, several violent shocks of an earthquake. Now, if you have an impact, even in, say, in the case of an atmospheric impact like Tunguska, or an actual impact into the ground, certainly an impact into the ground of a hypervelocity object is going to trigger earthquakes. Now, here again, what we have to realize and think about is that many times, the evidence is now suggesting that many times impacts can occur in clusters. Now, witness in one place, there were people who, experienced some of the effects of Tunguska without knowing that it had been an event in the sky, right? People heard what they described as a subterranean rumbling, like the sound of multiple freight trains passing under their feet, without really knowing necessarily that maybe 70 miles away, there was this tremendous violent atmospheric explosion, right? So you may have people in one area witnessing the fall of cosmic debris, right? But somewhere far removed from them, there might be an actual impact or an aerial burst along the lines of Tunguska that they're unaware of. But they are aware of the secondary consequences, which manifest as earthquakes. Okay, so then we get to what I consider some of the most important work on our catastrophic past on this planet, the work of neo-catastrophists from Britain, two of the most prominent, Victor Klube and Bill Napier. They wrote a book, came out in 1990, called The Cosmic Winter, which I have read. I think it's probably available online, but it's probably out of print, so it may be expensive, but you can look it up if you can get a hold of it. Highly recommend it. If it's still available, we will put a link on our updated website, which will be coming out very soon, and we'll put a link to that in our bookstore of recommended reading. Anyways, this is what they have to say. Later, there was another attempt to defeat Zeus when the earth gave birth to Typhon, a flaming winged monster whose head reached to the stars, who had 100 serpents' heads in place of fingers, who was nothing but vipers from the waist down, and whose eyes flashed fire. Typhon was destroyed by Zeus's thunderbolts and fell aflame to the ground. Now, that's very interesting because there's a parallel there with the story of Fate, the son of Helios, who tried to drive his father's chariot in the path of the sun, but because he was too weak and inexperienced, the four great steeds pulling the chariot deviated away from the path of the ecliptic, descended to earth, set the earth on fire, and in order to save the earth, Zeus had to hurl a thunderbolt at Phaeton, and he then met his demise by falling to earth, and then falling into the river Eridanus. So we have, in this case, Zeus's thunderbolts taking out Typhon and Zeus's thunderbolts taking out Phaeton. Then the authors here go on. Typhon is explicitly recognized as a comet in classical and early medieval times. Very important, right? Now, so is, being described as such by the astrologer Leitus in AD 490 to 565, by Plutarch and by Pliny, who 800 years after Hesiod describes a comet called Typhon having spiral-like glowing red knots. The spiral motif, as we have seen, could only have been connected with a comet if it were an extraordinary body. And Carl Sagan, in his book on comets, suggests that possibly a rapidly spinning nucleus throwing out tongues of volatile gases could give that appearance. And in fact, he even shows, and I can show you as we go here, even in the Chinese accounts of comets and the different types of comets, there's one type of a comet that's represented as a whirling type of object that looks like a swastika. Okay. And possibly, even I think that Carl Sagan was intimating that that could have been the origin of the swastika symbol as a symbol of cosmic power. So here is a ancient Babylonian cylinder seal that shows Marduk here doing battle with the great dragon Tiamat. So this is a counterpart to the battle between Zeus and Typhon. So Tiamat has all of the same characteristics we just associated with Typhon. And ultimately, Marduk defeats the great dragon Tiamat. And I would suggest that this could be a possible reference to a cosmic event. And you can see here some of the stuff that Marduk is wielding. It looks like he could be wielding even a Vajra here. We see, notice this figure over here, this up here. This could be the sun, or it could also be something exploding in the sky. And just as a reminder, the Tunguska cosmic event, this is 5 miles from ground zero, 20 years after the blast. Something like 820 square miles of old-growth taiga forest were completely decimated. Tens of millions of trees were destroyed. And this would be enough to take out any urban area on Earth. An explosion of this magnitude, we've discussed it multiple times here in these episodes, 15 megatons. A 15 megaton blast is about roughly equivalent to the largest nuclear hydrogen bombs tested in the American arsenals during the peak of the Cold War back in the 1950s. So here, Theatrum Cometicum from 1667. This is a traditional European depiction of a comet and meteors as cosmic serpents. Now, with this, we're just going to look for a second at an orbit of a typical meteor stream, this being the Taurid meteors. Now, for those of you that have watched my Halloween presentation, I include this and was actually created this for the Halloween presentation, which, even though it's focused on Halloween, it's a broad net that covers a bunch of stuff that most people don't realize is all interrelated and interconnected, and then manifests through our ceremony, our yearly observation of Halloween, which was ultimately descended from the universal observation of the Day of the Dead. What we're going to do here is we're going to look at this, and you're going to see that you've got two orange ellipses here. Now, this is based upon photographic studies that were done by Fred Whipple originally. But what they do is, if you look at two of them, what I've done is I've selected two that represent the limits of the Taurid stream, right? So if you look here, you can see here's the sun. Let's go through this. This is the sun, and here's the orbit of Mercury. Here's the orbit of Venus, and here's the orbit of Earth. Here's the orbit of Mars. The arrows show the direction of the orbits. So we're going around this way. This is the orbit of the Earth. Going this way, the stream is moving this way. And this is the orbit of Jupiter. So you can see that the reason I've picked these two is they kind of demarcate the limits of the shower, right? So one was at kind of the outermost limit, one was at the innermost limit of the shower. So you can see if the Earth is moving around the sun here, and then it takes some passage of time, this is actually a couple of weeks to traverse this distance here. I'm going to go to the next one here. So yeah, now you can see I've provided some dates here. I've done a little graphic here to help visualize that this is the meteor stream here. Now you can see here as the meteor streams are coming in this way, they make their perihelion passage. It's called perihelion, meaning it's closest to the Earth, to the sun, right? Perihelion, right? So then it comes around this way. It comes from behind the sun. And then roughly around June 30th, it is when the Earth crosses the stream, okay? Then some months pass, June, July, August, September, October, and then at the end of October, the early November, we see that the Earth crosses the stream a second time. Now, the difference here between these two crossings is that in June, it's crossing the orbit, the Taurid meteor shower, as the stuff is coming from its close passage by the sun. So obviously, if you think about it, if you're here looking upstream to see where this stuff is coming from, you're not going to see much because you're looking almost directly at the sun. Whereas when you get over here to November 1st, you're looking upstream. So an object approaching during this stream here is going to be visible much sooner than it is over here on June 30th. For obvious reasons, right? You can see that, right? Here, if an object is approaching, you're looking upstream towards the sun. You're not going to see it until the very last second, basically. And then here, you're looking away from the sun. You're looking out, following this arrow, and it leads directly to the Pleiades. The Pleiades, the star cluster, is the radiant point, if you will, where the meteors appear to be emanating from, okay? Now, the Pleiades, in the classical depiction of Taurus, the bull, and hence the name the Taurids, the Taurid meteor shower, the Pleiades occupies the shoulder of the bull. So basically, if you're going to go out on around November 1st, actually it takes a couple of weeks to cross the whole stream, but the peak of that is around the last few days of October and the first few days of November. Now, in the Halloween live stream that I did, which is now available, the whole recorded version of it is available online. You can download it. I think it's pretty affordable. But it goes into explaining this association between the Taurid meteor shower and the origins of Halloween and the Day of the Dead. And I think if you're interested in this kind of stuff at all, if you're interested in the catastrophic history of our planet, its effects on civilization, if you're interested in symbolism and metaphors, if you're interested in some of the ceremonial traditions and customs of our own modern times, there's a lot to unpack in that Halloween presentation that I put together. But this is the thing to keep in mind. Now, we've talked so much about the Tunguska event. Now, here I think you'll be able to, if you haven't put this two and two together yet, here's your opportunity. Tunguska occurred on June 30th, right at the peak of the summertime Taurids. So the timing during the year was precisely what it would have needed to have been in order to be a member of the Taurid family of meteors, comets, and asteroids. Okay? Secondly, eyewitnesses describe the emergence of the meteorite as coming from the sun. Some of the descriptions refer to it as being born out of the sun. One of the descriptions saying born, as it were, from the sun. Well, in other words, because it's coming directly from the sun, or it appears to be from the vantage point of an observer on the Earth. So that's precisely where you would expect a Taurid meteor to be coming out of the sky, Okay. So its placement in the sky is consistent with a Taurid meteor, and its timing is consistent with a Taurid meteor. That doesn't mean that the Tunguska, it doesn't prove that it was a member of the Taurid meteor stream. But what it does do is it makes a very strong circumstantial case that that is, in fact, what it was. And Bill Napier has written a whole paper on looking at the evidence that possibly the younger Dryas bolide, or multiple bolides, as the case may be, were members of the Taurid meteor stream. Okay. So here now is kind of what we post with the studies that were done in 1986 and afterwards with the return of Comet Halley. We learned something about the structure of comet nuclei, which we kind of already knew, but which I think is very significant, especially in understanding the way it may have affected the ancient world, and also the way these events were encoded into symbolism. So here is the Halley-type comet nucleus, and now in the next image, we're going to look at a cutaway view. And what we have here is we have a frozen icy matrix loaded with volatiles that we can see are outgassing here, and then macroscopic debris. Now, all of this stuff could be anywhere from large chunks of ice to boulders that are being contained within this matrix here. Then there's a crust that kind of binds it all together, but when a comet nucleus comes in close to a planet or comes in towards the sun, both gravity forces and thermal forces can cause the comet nucleus to begin to disaggregate or to disintegrate. It begins with the outgassing of volatiles, as is depicted here, but you can visualize from this what would happen if this nucleus completely disintegrated. Well, what you would have then is you would have countless thousands, hundreds of thousands possibly, of shooting stars that could range from specks the size of a grain of sand to the size of your thumbnail, all the way up to the size of the Tunguska object and larger. Now, the Tunguska object, remember, estimates are that it was about 150 feet in diameter. Well, a 10-mile comet nucleus like this could contain potentially hundreds of thousands of Tunguska-like objects. This is something that we should keep in mind, because if we're basing our ideas of planetary defense upon just a single, isolated asteroid impact, of course, that might be one scenario. And then we know from repeated close encounters over the last 20 or 30 years, since we've been really keeping track, that impacts of asteroids are way more common than we would have previously imagined. And this is something that I document and get into again in the series on the apocalyptic series in Squaring the Circle. So I highly recommend, because this is such an important subject, I highly recommend going back and reviewing those, rewatching them. And as you watch them for the second or even the third time, that's when you're going to begin to see the connections forming. That's when you're going to begin to see sort of an integral pattern linking all of these things together, right? From impacts that leave astrobleams and craters in the ground to airbursts like Tunguska, to near misses that we know we've experienced repeatedly in the last 20 or 30 years. I started keeping track and recording near misses in 1988. And there's been at least several hundred since then. And the episodes dealing with that, the Squaring the Circle episodes dealing with that phenomenon, I call close encounters while mankind sleeps, because the majority of the human race, the human species, including professionals and scientists, other than a small group, are basically oblivious to the fact that many of these events have been occurring in recent times. And I think, let me see if I can pull this up here. In this past year, this past June 29th, I may have talked about this. I'm going to talk about it again, though, because it was really such an important wake-up call for us. In June 29th of this year, now notice the date. Notice the date, right? So this is peak of the summertime torrids. So asteroid 2024 MK flew past the Earth well within the lunar orbit. Now I'm going to say, and it's not going to be the focus of this particular discussion, but we now know that there's no necessarily clear line of definition separating comets from asteroids. We now know that we've seen and witnessed a lot of asteroids that are displaying cometary behavior, apparently outgassing volatiles and so on. We also see what look to be devolatilized comet nuclei that are very much like asteroids, okay? So this is something that we're kind of like, the definitions here of asteroids on one side, comets on another side are beginning to dissolve, okay? So anyways, on June 29th of this year, asteroid 2024 MK flew past the Earth well within the lunar orbit. I wrote this, in maybe late summer after this had passed. It was one that I found particularly impressive, so I wrote about it. And that's what I'm reading from here. It was only discovered on June 16th, less than 2 weeks before its rendezvous with Earth. This asteroid was estimated to be between 500 and 800 feet in diameter. Now, that's much, much bigger than the Tunguska object, right? Something that's 800 feet in diameter would be, remember, because if these are roughly spherical, then the volume of a sphere scales by the cube of the radius. So we can talk, that's something that I've talked about and we'll talk about again, just so we get a sense of the scale. So anyways, this object, 2024 MK, flying past the Earth, it was much bigger than Tunguska, okay? With only a slightly different trajectory, this object could have collided with the Earth, causing an explosion with the power of at least 500 to 600 1-megaton hydrogen bombs. Now, this is more than the combined energy of all nuclear weapons presently in the world. Had it been on this slightly different trajectory, and had it made an Earth impact, it would have blasted a crater somewhere around 2.5 miles wide and about 1,500 feet, 1,500 feet deep. Fireball generated by the impact would have been well over 3 miles in diameter, and in a densely populated area such as the East Coast of the United States, more than 1 million people would have been instantly vaporized in the fireball or killed from the blast. Another 200,000 people would die from the 240 decibel shock wave. About 500,000 people would receive third-degree burns, and another 2.5 million would suffer from second-degree burns. Within 9 to 13 miles of the blast center, survivors would experience lung damage and ruptured eardrums. Within 25 miles of the impact epicenter, trees would be knocked down and ignite into flames. Or most buildings would collapse up to 22 miles from the impact site, and houses within 30 miles would be destroyed. A powerful earthquake, at least 6.3 on the Richter scale, and probably much greater than that, as you are in the proximity of the actual impact epicenter, would kill thousands of more people, and it could be felt up to 40 miles or more away. The peak wind speeds emanating outward from the area of the blast would reach up to 8,000 miles per hour. Inside of 20 miles of the blast, it would have felt like being inside an F5 tornado. So the natural calamities that could affect human civilization in profound ways are numerous. Yet, I mentioned this. The priorities of most of the political establishment entirely neglect these possibilities in favor of contrived scenarios built on cherry-picked science exploited to promote a preordained conclusion that humankind is causing a climate crisis by the use of fossil fuels. But the irony of this is that as we stand on the threshold of a new industrial civilization based upon plasma physics, if it is not suppressed, the whole question of fossil fuel use and CO2-induced climate change becomes irrelevant. But not to get off on that track now. So anyways, I'm going to show a couple of pictures here to give you the, there we go. So here we have a second generation disintegration of comet Schwarzmann-Wachmann, fragment B, photographed by the Hubble Space Telescope, April 18th, 2006. And what we see here is what we now know as the ultimate fate of comets if they don't crash into planets or fall into the sun, and that is they disintegrate and they create meteor streams. But in those meteor streams, you might have extraordinarily major objects such as Tunguska and up to perhaps a half kilometer or kilometer in diameter. In fact, it's been estimated by Klube and Napier that in the Taurid meteor stream, there may be dozens of objects that we haven't detected yet that could be half a kilometer to a kilometer in diameter. And then, of course, this was another one of the great cosmic teaching events of recent history. This was the impact of 21 objects from the disintegration of an original single nucleus in July 1994, Shoemaker-Levy 9. And what we learned from this is that, yes, comets can start out as a single nucleus. They can fragment and produce multiple nuclei, and these nuclei can then crash into planets. In this case, it was Jupiter. What had been happening here, and most likely, is that for hundreds of years, so centuries, maybe even millennia, Shoemaker-Levy 9, unbeknownst to astronomers on Earth, had been circling between the Sun and Jupiter. Well, each passage around Jupiter, Jupiter's great gravity field tightens its orbit and brought it in a little closer. And what we discovered was, it was Carolyn Shoemaker and David Levy, who were co-discoverers of this comet, so therefore it bears their name. And what we saw was the last, or we could say, the last parajovian orbit of this nucleus. It passed so close to Jupiter, without hitting it, but it passed so close to Jupiter that the incredibly strong gravity field of Jupiter literally ripped the single nucleus into 21 pieces. And it was discovered just as this fragmenting nucleus was emerging from behind Jupiter. And then over the next 3 or 4 months, it was seen that these 21 separate objects spread out in space and formed the so-called string of pearls. After 3 to 4 months of observations, the astronomers were able to construct its elliptical geometry, and they were able to construct its period of revolution. And once they had those two major facts in hand, they were able to project where it was going to be and when it was going to be going into the future. So it's sort of an example of prophecy, if you will. They were able to predict that in around the second week of July 1994, these objects, this chain of pearls, was going to cross Jupiter's orbit once again. But what made this so significant was the fact that when they crossed Jupiter's orbit and where they crossed Jupiter's orbit, at that time and place, Jupiter itself was going to be right at that spot. And therefore, these 21 pieces were going to collide with Jupiter, which they, in fact, did. It was the most watched astronomical event of the 20th century at that time. Extremely important lessons that we have derived from that, because now, prior to Shoemaker-Levy 9, most models of cosmic impact were just single isolated events. One object, one impact. But with this, we learned that, yes, you can have a multiple impact event. I believe that this set up the potential for a model of the Younger Dryas encounter, because it looks to me very much like there was more than a single impact associated with the Younger Dryas, the lower Younger Dryas boundary. There may have been multiple impacts. In fact, I would speculate that there could have been 10 or more impacts between the Earth and members of some disintegrated comet back during the Younger Dryas. And we are going to explore and get up to date on what the latest research says about the Younger Dryas in a series of upcoming episodes. We're going to really unpack that and try to derive what lessons it has to teach our modern civilization. Because let me say this, archaeologists now are going to claim that there's nothing really happening in prehistory that could be construed as science, technology, advanced civilizations. They're always down on Graham Hancock, calling him names because he's willing to ask questions and hypothesize the possibility that there may have been more going on in ancient history than has been recognized up to this point. Well, that scenario was completely dismissed by the archaeological establishment, who, for whatever reason, are highly invested in this uniform linear model they've got of prehistory that excludes any possibility for an advanced or sophisticated or scientifically based culture. Now, this is a question that I feel is not closed to scientific inquiry and needs to be investigated. We're going to get into that. That's part of the themes we're going to be exploring in depth with this podcast and with Cosmographia, the sister podcast that I'm still doing with Brad Young and a number of other, hopefully, visitors that will be able to bring their expertise to the table. Remember, Cosmographia comes from the term cosmography, which was sort of the all-encompassing view of how the world system works, okay? That's why I chose that particular name for that podcast. So because of the fact that there are these sort of divergent areas, but of course overlapping, I feel like it was advantageous to actually have two podcasts that sort of have slightly different but overlapping zones of interest. Okay, so I think we're getting to the point where we're going to wrap up this episode. We'll look at the next slide image here, and I think we'll close with this. This is comet linear, and we see here two stages of the fragmentation. In the first stage of the breakup of the nucleus here, and then if you zoom in on this, you can see, and if you look this up online, I think you can find some fairly high-resolution images of this. Again, take your notes just pause this whenever you want to get more references or whatever. You can see I've got the references down here for you to find it. But what's happening here is the single nucleus is broken up into hundreds of subnuclei, if you will. Now, you can imagine that the Earth encountering a blob, a swarm, I'll call it a swarm like this, the probabilities of an impact are going to be much higher than you would have if it was a single object. Now, if it was all in a single object, obviously, that one progenitor object would be more catastrophic striking the Earth than one of the subnuclei that we see here, one of the pieces, right? However, the probabilities of being struck by the Earth, once the nucleus is fragmented into hundreds or perhaps thousands of pieces, that probability is going to be much, much higher, see? And if some of these pieces are in the range of Tunguska and bigger, up to 400 feet in diameter, and Earth is struck by multiple objects of that scale, yeah, it would be like a nuclear war without, of course, the radiation. Unless, of course, what we now also know from Tunguska is that there was a dramatic drop in ozone in the aftermath of the Tunguska event. A drop in ozone now allows, the ozone acts as an insulating blanket that helps to prevent cosmic radiation from striking the surface of the Earth. So if you have an impact or multiple impacts along the lines of Tunguska, it's likely that the ozone layer is going to be dramatically affected, allowing greater bombardment of cosmic rays. So there's a whole set of secondary phenomena here that we need to also be looking at. And as we go into this, in the next episode, I'm going to be continuing to dive deeper into the symbolical representation of these events by ancient cultures. And we're going to see how a lot of the traditions of prophecy were based upon this kind of a phenomena and the experience of this phenomena. Now, I'll make the final analogy here is that the astronomers looked at Shoemaker Levy 9 and were then able to project into the future and determine that a year hence that this was going to strike Jupiter. In a way, they were like prophets of old. Now, if we, there is going to be, in 2029, there's going to be a near miss between Earth and an asteroid. The question is will that asteroid then come back to, just like with Shoemaker Levy 9, the gravity field of Jupiter drew it every orbit around, it drew that object, that comet, in closer, right? The question is this the occurrence of the 2029 object going to undergo a similar process? But here's the thing. Once we've determined with a high degree of precision the orbital elements, that's what you call the orbital elements of any orbiting object, whether it's a comet or whether it's an asteroid or whatever, you can now make predictions with a high degree of accuracy as to where they're going to be and when they're going to be there, right? So what that does is it kind of puts the modern astronomers who now can make predictions and projections like this sort of in a way is like our modern day prophets. And I'm going to suggest the idea that the traditions that have come down to us of intensive, obsessive observation of the sky and what's happening in the sky were all about being able to predict and understand the heavenly motions that were going to affect life on Earth here below. And so that will be where we continue with this in the next episode of Squaring the Circle. Thanks for joining me, and I hope to see you again. And look up our work on howtube.com, randallcarlson.com, and we'll see you in the next episode. Thanks. Greetings. Welcome to another episode of Squaring the Circle. I'm your host, Randall Carlson, and we're going to be continue to explore some interesting topics that I feel are actually extremely important for we, the human species, to know about. So we've been talking about cosmic impacts for a number of episodes now. In fact, I think this is going to be part 11 of the Apocalypse Unsealed series that I hope that somebody who works their way through all, I think it's going to end up being 12 parts. All 12 parts will come away with a pretty thorough understanding of this whole phenomena that I believe lies at the core or the foundation of all of the myths of apocalypse, traditions of apocalypse that have come down to us through the ages from multiple cultural sources. All right. So I think what we'll do is we will just dive right in here and start exploring some of the relevant information. And let us try to do this and see what happens. We are going to start by talking about comets. Let's see, what do we want to start? So here we go. Comet. We want to start with a definition first, then we'll move on from there. A comet is a celestial body moving about the sun in an elongated orbit, usually consisting of a central mass, the nucleus, surrounded by a misty envelope, which is the coma. It extends into a stream, which is the tail, in the direction away from the sun. And it's taken from the Middle English. This is an important clue right here for as we begin to decipher some of the ancient ways of encoding apocalyptic traditions. Okay? It's taken from the Middle English, which is taken from the Latin, which comes from the stem of cometa or cometa, which is taken from the Greek, and that is a modification of cometes, which literally means long-haired. And for anybody who has ever seen a comet, you would know that with the tail, you can almost imagine that somebody in earlier times might have looked at this phenomena and seen the tail of the comet almost as if it was long hair streaming out. And important point here, it says it's always pointing away from the sun. Now that's somewhat different from the trail. Okay, we're going to be looking at the tail and the trail. The tail is the gaseous, the ion tail, if you will. It's basically plasma, okay? The trail is actual debris that is spalling off of the comet. Now, we now know that comets have a life cycle, and in the final stages of their life cycle, they begin to disintegrate. That's part of their final phase of their existence or their life cycle, is that they begin to disintegrate. Now, if we go through just very briefly, we can cover this. We'll cover this in more detail as we go along. But you can think of a comet having 5 phases in its life cycle, and we're not going to go through and break it all down now. But just that at the beginning, a comet was probably refuse left over from the creation of the solar system, left over from the creation. The construction of the planets, the inner solid-bodied planets, okay? So the comets reside in 2 reservoirs, the Kuiper disk and the Oort cloud. And I've got a nice graphic from the same company that does Star Walks too, which we'll look at in a second. And you'll be able to envision this. But you've got these 2 reservoirs. This is what you want to keep in mind. Now, there's some little bit of controversy, but I think at this point, the 2 reservoirs, there's enough evidence that they're real, that they exist, that if you actually look into the studies, they're pretty rigorous. They're pretty robust, that there are these reservoirs of comets that contain literally billions upon billions of comets, okay? So these objects are generally very slowly orbiting, circling the sun. They're very far out there. I think what we'll do is we'll go to, let's see if we can see the Kuiper disk here. I've got a nice graphic. Here we go. This is Veto Technology Incorporated. They're the makers of the Star Walk 2. And they got a bunch of cool apps, if you're into astronomy, that you can get for your download for your phone, for your computer, whatever you want. I do Star Walk on my phone, and I love it. I go out and I see a celestial object in the sky. I want to know what it is. Boom, I just turn on my Star Walk. I aim it. Many of you know about there are other similar apps, but I use the Star Walk 2. You just aim it at the sky, point it after you've calibrated it very simply, then you point it at the sky, at the object, and you'll get a nice screen coming up that'll show you what exactly it is you're looking at. And in fact, I might even open it up here and let you look at it. But looking at this graphic, let's go back to the graphic here on my PowerPoint show. And so this here, you can see here, this is like a sphere. This is the Oort cloud. It's generally spherical. Okay. Then you have the Kuiper disk as a flattened area that most likely just grades into the spherical cloud. And you can see with this graphic here, this is showing the area, the region of the inner planets. And that, of course, is the region within which we reside on planet Earth. Now, the thing is we have to now enlarge our thinking, because we generally think of, well, the solar system, oh yeah, it's the sun and 9 planets. Well, not including the fact that Pluto has been demoted, so now there's only 8 planets. But we all, us older people, we always grew up with the 9 planets, and it included Pluto. And I certainly can understand the arguments for not including Pluto, but we won't get into that. Anyways, we always think of the solar system as being, well, the 9 planets, but really we have to enlarge the scope of our thinking now to include the Kuiper disk and the Oort cloud, because they are an integral part of the whole system and how it works. Without those, we essentially, the whole thing wouldn't function at all. So the point is that these are in a sort of a quasi-stable configuration, I would say. We could explain it that way. They're very, very sensitive to any kind of perturbation at all, right? But the fact is, out there in that region in the vacuum of space, there just aren't many perturbations that are going to upset them. Well, on the larger scale, the frame of the Oort cloud, what we would assume is that perhaps nearby supernovas that cause gravity waves and shock waves to move outward from the nova, okay, that could upset the balance, the very precariously balanced comets that are in the cloud, right? Perhaps a passing star could dislodge comets from the Oort cloud. Now, what's going to happen out there is those Oort cloud comets, that zone goes almost like halfway to the nearest stars, which is 3 to 4, 5 light years away. If it gets jostled, it might go one of two things. It might go further away from the sun and get captured into the orbit of another star, or it could start migrating towards the sun. Now, the Kuiper disk might be more influenced by the gravitational effects of the big 4 outer gaseous planets, which is Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, and Neptune. Now, we're going to talk about that again in probably in the next episode, in the next part about this. We'll get down into talking in detail about the 5 phases of the life cycle of a comet. But what you're seeing here would be the first phase in the life cycle of a comet, which is they're out there essentially in deep freeze, right? They've been there for millions of years in this close to zero, absolute zero temperature out there in deep space. But if something disturbs them and they start migrating in towards the solar system, then they enter another phase of their life cycle. They actually become active. You have to think of them in a way as hibernating. And then as they come into the inner solar system or move towards the sun, they begin to wake up. Now, we can now differentiate between the sources, the 2 source regions for comets that are entering into an orbit around the sun. One, if they're coming from a steep angle to the plane of the ecliptic, which is the orbital plane of the planets, then they're probably from the Oort cloud. If you just look at this graphic here, you can see that essentially a comet could come in towards the inner solar system from any direction, right? If something perturbs it, it starts moving and it moves in towards the sun. It can come in like at a steep angle. Now, the plane of the ecliptic is the orbital plane of the planets. If a comet comes in on that plane, it's probably originating in the Kuiper disk, because the Kuiper disk is essentially in that plane of the ecliptic extending out before it grades into the Oort cloud. So what causes comets to become dislodged from the Kuiper disk and start moving towards the sun? Probably more the influence of like I said, the planets. And again, there's a very interesting geometry between the ratio of the masses and the distances of the outer 4 gaseous planets and its effect on the inner zone of the Kuiper disk. Anyways, if a comet is coming in from the Oort cloud and it's coming in from a steep angle, chances are it's on a parabolic orbit, which means, if you know the geometry of your conic sections, you know that a parabola is open-ended, right? So if a comet comes in on an open-ended, a parabolic orbit, it's going to come in, it's going to make a loop around the sun, and it's going to go out, and it'll probably never return. If it comes in from the Kuiper disk, it tends to get caught between a Jovian orbit, Jupiter, and the sun. So it's oscillating back and forth, if you will. It orbits the sun and either goes out to Jupiter and goes outside of the orbit of Jupiter, or it'll sometimes flip and come inside the orbit of Jupiter. In any case, those comets are going to be the ones that are the most dangerous in terms of the consequences of their life cycle in terms of Earth, because they lie in the plane of the planets. Now, comets disintegrate. That's part of their life cycle. The nucleus of a comet is not very solidly bound. In fact, it's more like an icy matrix, and it's suffused with volatiles and a variety of different kinds of material. And if that thing starts to come apart, then it spews a lot of debris into its orbit. That is what forms the trail. Meteor showers are part of the solid material that has ultimately originated from a comet, okay? And we've looked at some of that in the previous episodes. So let's just go on here and see what's coming up. We don't need to get into this right now, but what this shows you is the what's called the orbital elements. And with these, scientists can essentially become prophets of cosmic phenomena, because if they know this geometry, if they know these things here, descending node, ascending node, perihelion, first point of Aries, and the plane of the ecliptic, and the aphelion, if they know those things, if they know those elements, they can make very accurate predictions about where an orbiting object is going to be and when it's going to be there. And this is just another variation of it. Okay, so this is what I wanted to get to. Here are some comets. This is Comet Kohoutek, late 1973 when that came in, early 1974. What I remember about this particularly is, I do remember it well, is because this was one of the first times when I really remember that there were a lot of concern and fear, because a lot of people believed that Comet Kohoutek signaled some kind of apocalyptic event was going to happen. And there are all these predictions around it and so on about sweeping global changes and things that were going to happen, which, as I recall, didn't really happen, other than that Comet Kohoutek was a beautiful object in the night sky for a few weeks, actually a couple of months. But as far as my own interests were, it really did stimulate my interest in these kinds of phenomena. So I could say that my interest in comets really kind of goes back to that Comet Kohoutek. And that would have been the first comet I ever saw, personally. And then there was the image of Comet Hyakutake taken by Shigemi Numazawa from Niigata, Japan. Now, Comet Hyakutake came by very close to the time of Comet Hale-Bopp. Now, there were some interesting things about Hyakutake that we learned, is that it had a lot of methane, ethane, and even acetylene. It was discharging acetylene. Okay, now that's very interesting. And in my Cosmographia shows that I did talking about the great firestorms, I mentioned that as possibly being a factor of significance. I want you to notice here the blue tail coming off here, the blue gaseous tail. Many comets have that blue gaseous tail. Comet West. Now, this is very, to me, interesting, because the tail of the comet was such that one can really understand how a lot of ancient peoples, particularly the Chinese, looked at comets and thought of great cosmic brooms. In fact, they were even, I don't know the Chinese word, but they were called broom comets. And interestingly, because of the traditions and the associations with near cometary apparitions, they came to believe that a comet approaching the Earth indicated or heralded great sweeping changes in the world. And as we now know scientifically, in some cases, that is absolutely true. There's another one of Comet Hyakutake. Again, notice the blue tail. And I always like this one. I use this in the Halloween presentation that I did because it has such a ghostly appearance. Halley's Comet. This was photographed during its 1910 apparition. And yes, this is oftentimes comets were actually envisioned. It's interesting. Think about this now. When you talk about like a ghostly appearance, the appearance of a ghost or a ghostly figure like that, it's referred to as an apparition. And when you talk about the appearance of a comet, they use it's the same exact term, apparition. So I kind of mentioned that as being maybe perhaps more than coincidental in the Halloween presentation that I do. So yeah, this I like this picture because it really does kind of convey sort of that ghostly sense, and how there were people who witnessed in some of the eyewitness accounts. They are described in language that would indicate that they were thinking of ghosts. Comet Holmes. Yeah, here's another 1910 showing a tail detachment. Look right here. You can see the tail is beginning to detach. Right here, you see this? So here's 67 seconds after impact, Comet Tempel 1 being struck by the Deep Impact spacecraft right here. Now, Tempel is associated with one of the great meteor streams, the Leonids. And comets of 1744, this is Chesso's comet of 1774. The comet's head, you can't see, is below the horizon. And notice this is really would have been a sight to see. The tail fans into 6 distinct streams or rays. The inset down here shows the relation of the tail here to the hidden nucleus, if you could see the entire comet at once. And just a pair of fireball. Well, you've got one great Leonid fireball coming in here, and it's got a little attendant with it. Now, were these two circulating as completely separate objects before they encountered Earth's atmosphere, or did this smaller piece break off the larger piece? I have no idea what the answer to that is. And just a nice painting that was done, obviously, pre-9/11. And I kind of thought this was sort of significant in the aftermath because it almost looks like the comet is headed for the Twin Towers. That would have been Comet Hale-Bopp, I believe. Okay, so now let's take a look at the nucleus of a comet. Now, after the last apparition of Comet Halley in 1986, we learned a lot about comets that we didn't know before, and we got considerably deeper insight into the structure of a cometary nucleus. Now, I've shown this before, but it doesn't hurt to review it quickly. You'll see the volatiles spewing out here. And then when you take a cross-section, what you see here is solid material. It could be anything. It could be silicate material. And you see the volatiles, the gases spewing out. And the point here, now this along the long axis here, this is about a 10-mile wide long comet. It could have literally thousands of these macroscopic chunks in it that once the comet begins to disintegrate, you'll see that it can litter its pathway with all kinds of stuff. Now, like I said, meteors are the byproduct of comet disintegrations, right? Now, typically your shooting star is going to be very tiny. It's probably not going to be much bigger than your thumb. But it's still going to be, when it comes in at such a high rate of speed, it can create, when that potential energy gets converted to kinetic energy, it can make quite an impressive light show. Now, if you get something bigger, the size of your fist or size of a basketball or larger, it can really be a spectacular sight. And we know we've talked a lot here in these series of Apocalypse Unsealed about Tunguska and that event. So go back and review that episode of this series, because there's a lot of material here. And if you really want to get a good solid handle on what the implications of this are, you really need to revisit some of the stuff so you can get down, because remember the old saying, the devil is in the details. And you're going to find out in a very interesting way that, yes, the devil really is hiding in these details. So, speaking of cometary nuclei breaking up, here's the famous string of pearls from Shoemaker-Levy 9. This is a cometary debris chain. Now, this was a single comet nucleus, but just before its discovery, it had passed very close to the surface of Jupiter. Now, all the big planets have this zone with surrounding them that's where the gravitational field is strong enough to overcome the coherence, the cohesiveness of a cosmic body like a comet. Now, you'd probably, logic would tell you and that like a solid asteroidal type body is going to be much less prone to disintegrating than a cometary nucleus, which is mostly a bunch of stuff encased in ice, right? So what we had here was a single nucleus that fractured as it passed into what's called the Roche limit. Remember, the Roche limit is the zone that within the gravitational field of a primary is strong enough to overcome the coherence of a secondary. Now, in this case, obviously, a very big planet like Jupiter is going to have a very strong Roche limit that extends quite a ways out. And of course, a comet is going to be weakly bound, so it's going to pass within that Roche limit, and the gravity field of Jupiter is literally going to tear it apart. In this case here, we had one nucleus that became 21 nuclei. Now, this was in March of 1993 that it was discovered. So now, astronomers, this named Shoemaker-Levy 9 after Carolyn Shoemaker and David Levy, who co-discovered the comet, just as it's emerging into the field of view around Jupiter. So it was I think maybe no more than 4 months of observations allowed astronomers to calculate all those orbital elements that I just showed you, right? The two main ones were number one, the geometry of the elliptical orbit, right? The second one was its velocity. Now, all of that can, and then of course, the plane of the ecliptic has already established the ascending node and the descending node. Though that's just a matter of gathering the empirical data, right? But once you have all of that, and then you look at and you've got enough observations over a long enough period of time, you can take a piece of that ellipse that it defines its orbit, and you can then reconstruct the entire elliptical orbit. Now, if you know the changes in the velocity, and it is changing, because as the comet, let's say, is moving away from Jupiter, the gravity field of Jupiter is going to tend to want to slow it down. But as it moves away from Jupiter, Jupiter's gravity field, its influence gets less and less, and the gravity of the sun becomes more and more. And eventually, it's the gravity field of the sun that now dominates the velocity of the comet. And then, of course, it's going to be accelerating. But all that can be worked out. It's all just the matter of using calculus. You can compute those changes. So now you've got the geometries, and you've got the shape of the ellipse, you've got the velocity, and now you can run it forward or you can run it backward. You'll know where this thing has been. A lot of the studies of, like, say, the Taurid meteor stream, I'll use that for an example. There are two streams, the of the Taurids. There's the daytime Taurids, and then there's nighttime Taurids, and they're slightly different orbits, just slightly different. So undoubtedly, what happened is that sometime in the past, a single piece broke into two pieces, And then subsequent to that, those two pieces also disintegrated further and basically produced two meteor streams. And within those meteor streams, we have Comet Encke, which was probably, well, I won't say probably, almost certainly part of the original cometary nucleus. There's also a couple of asteroidal-like bodies and another cometary body called Old Giotto. So it's actually quite a populated family of cosmic material, right? Well, it was undoubtedly at one time all in a single nucleus of a very large comet that came into the solar system probably between 25 and 30,000 years ago. How do we know that? Well, because once we've established these orbital parameters, like I said, we can now run it forward or we can run it backwards. The astronomer Fred Whipple was probably the first one to do this back in the 40s when he had, I think, 14, he had photographs of 14 meteors within the Taurid meteor stream, and he was able to calculate their orbits, reverse them, and realize that they were all part of a single object somewhere around 5,000 years ago. Okay? Because what happens, you start reversing these meteors and you follow them back, and they're going backwards through their orbits, and then they all converge on the same point in space. Well, that's when you know that they were part of a single object that then broke apart, right? Now you can also run it forward, and that's what astronomers did, and they were able to predict that this material was going to come in, make its perihelion or close passage by the sun, go back out to the orbit of Jupiter, right, and cross the orbit of Jupiter. What they then realized was that when that stream was crossing the orbit of Jupiter, guess what? Jupiter was at that point in its orbit. So they knew it was going to be a series of impacts. And they were able to predict right down to the day when those first impacts were going to hit. Here is an artist's rendering of what it would have looked like if we could have seen it from a vantage point near Jupiter. 3 different perspectives. This is what we actually saw. The material came in and was striking Jupiter just enough around the sphere that we couldn't see directly the impacts. What we did see, though, was the effects of the impacts once Jupiter rotated around. And here would be what it would look like if we had been slightly looking at it from a somewhat different perspective. The 21 pieces would have come in and fallen into the Jovian atmosphere and created, when they did this, they created these gigantic plumes that were bigger than the Earth. And the interesting thing, the takeaway here, is that what astronomers realized was that any one of these objects, take any one of these 21 objects, they were all big enough that were just one of these objects to encounter the Earth, it would be a major catastrophe. What about 21 objects? Well, that would be an extinction level event. Now, no astronomers believed or thought that we would witness something like this until we witnessed it. That was something that you would call an extinction level event if it occurred on Earth. Now, I think that in a way, the cosmos was kind of giving us a lesson here in the potential of our existence within the universe, right? It's most likely that multiple impact events, and this is one of the insights gained from this event here, is that multiple impact events are a whole lot more common than had been imagined prior to Shoemaker-Levy 9. Prior to Shoemaker-Levy 9, most researchers and astronomers and geologists, people who are looking at in any way the impact phenomena, are generally thinking in terms of like one single impact of one single object. Well, Shoemaker-Levy 9 has demanded that we rethink the phenomena of impacts, right? Because now we have 21 impacts in a week. What does that mean? What would that mean in terms of Earth? Well, obviously, something like this would be, like I said, it would be more than enough to terminate civilization. It would be an extinction level event. And now that we're going back and taking a closer look at some of the cratering effects on other bodies, I believe this is on the moon. You can actually count here 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. Looks like this was about 12 pieces. And the fragmentation would have occurred very close to the impact, the moment of impact. Why? Well, because the longer that these pieces are in orbit before they disintegrate into dust or separate further, the further apart they're going to be. Well, you can see these objects are really close together. You can see these are a little bit further apart, right? So you can kind of surmise from it. You can see here, like this one here, you've got almost two distinct, completely distinct craters. If we look at the back here, you can see that they're all pretty much overlapping. So from this, you can determine that, this fragmentation that produced this chain called catena, they're called catena or crater chains, probably had a little bit more time between fragmentation and impact. Here's another one. And here you can very clearly, distinctly count the number of impacts and pieces. So this could have been, again, I don't know, could have been an asteroid that broke up, because asteroids do break up. They certainly do. A lot of asteroids have suffered extremely catastrophic lives, smashing into other asteroids. So they can become fractured, they can become cracked. So as long as, they don't run into anything else, like this running into a planet or a strong gravity field, the object may hang together. But then when it comes into, makes a close approach by a planet, falls into a gravity field, that conglomeration of material can then separate and form separate bodies, separate objects. And here's another one. So they're relatively common. Now, we talked a lot about Tunguska. I think we did 2 episodes in this Apocalypse Unsealed series, diving into Tunguska, because Tunguska had so much to teach us about the cosmic ecosystem of which our world is a part, and which we ultimately must pay attention to if we think in terms of long-term survival of civilization. We're going to have to deal with that, right? Because what we now know is that impacts that can have global consequences occur a whole lot more frequently than we thought a generation or 2 ago. In fact, major impacts may occur every 1 to 2,000 years that could dramatically affect the stability of civilization. Again, Tunguska has shown us that one object carried the force of a 15 megaton hydrogen bomb. Now, what if we have multiple Tunguskas? Now, if we're looking at this surface of the moon, well, there's going to be a difference. They're a friable object like a cometary nucleus, which is breaking up, doesn't have to go through an atmosphere. So it's going to be much more likely to strike the surface of the moon, or say Mercury, or one of some of the other moons, say of Jupiter or Saturn, which have also show crater chains on them. So whereas an object like Tunguska, well, remember, important point, didn't make it to the ground, did not hit the surface of the ground. It blew up in the atmosphere, right? So a Tunguska event doesn't leave a crater. So this is important. So what is the ratio? Here's the question. And what is the ratio of impacting objects that leave a crater that can later be counted, and the number of impacting objects that strike the atmosphere, do not make it to the ground, and therefore they do not really leave a major geological imprint that can be cataloged later on? And as it turns out, interestingly, it's almost certain that Tunguska-type objects are going to be way more common than the higher density objects that can actually penetrate fully through the atmosphere and strike the ground, leaving a hole in the ground, a crater. And here we use the comparison of Tunguska to meteor crater in Arizona. Now, meteor crater in Arizona was an iron object about the same size as the Tunguska object. What's the difference? Well, an iron object is a whole lot denser. It's going to penetrate fully through the atmosphere and strike the ground, whereas the Tunguska object doesn't penetrate the atmosphere, blows up 5-6 miles up in the atmosphere, blows down hundreds of millions of trees, but, well, let's say 100 million trees, but it does not leave a crater. Okay, so here's the question then. What is the ratio of impacts of denser objects, like, say, a carbonaceous chondritic meteor, which is going to be much more prone to striking the ground? And here's a good continuum to think of. Comets on the low end of density scale, like a snowball. On the high end of the density scale, cast iron. That's an iron object. Right in the middle somewhere is the stony asteroids, which is about roughly, like I said, about in the middle. Okay, so you've got this continuum, and on the low density end of the continuum, you're not having impacts into the ground, unless, of course, they're quite large. Now, an object the size of the Tunguska is going to be something along the lines of maybe 1/4 of a mile before it actually strikes the ground, right? So, what's the ratio of dense objects that strike the ground compared to low-density objects that blow up in the atmosphere and don't leave a big crater in the ground? And it looks like it could be like 10-1. So in other words, for every crater, there might be craters such as you would see in Arizona, meteor crater, we might have 10 Tunguska-type events. Now, this is important, right? Because, again, if we're only counting craters, we're probably underestimating the number of encounters between Earth and cosmic objects by a factor of 10. All right. And here we see, this is in some interesting photographs here. Here we see comet Schwarzmann-Wachmann in the early stages of disintegration right here. So we've actually witnessed multiple times now that comets do disintegrate. And here you can see the close-up of the debris tail. You can see there's larger stuff here that's probably could be anywhere from, 0.5 kilometer and up in size. Smaller stuff could be, hundreds of Tunguska objects. And then within that, there'll be, lots and lots of, really small stuff that will eventually become part of a meteor stream. Okay, just another one where you can see, look at the separation that is occurring here. So you've got the major nucleus here, and then you've got like a secondary nucleus here. They've separated, and then look at here. Look at the little offspring coming off of the second one. See, and this is what comets do. And if they don't get swallowed up by the sun, which is if they don't disintegrate and turn into a meteor stream, it's likely that they're going to fall into the sun. And that's where a lot of them end up. And then potentially, like we saw with Shoemaker-Levy 9, falling into Jupiter or Earth or any of the other planets. Okay, and in the comet linear, look at this down here. You can see the debris swarm here. Now, I want you to think about this. The difference we're talking about between an encounter with a single object and how different it would be to encounter a swarm of recently disintegrated cometary material. It would be two very different things. And you can see that from the standpoint of encountering a cluster or a swarm, I like to use the term swarm of debris, it could be very different. We do computer modeling to, let's say, model, say, a meteor the size of 150 feet in diameter, roughly the size of the iron asteroid that struck Arizona. Right? Now, we can model that. We put in coefficients for its density, for its velocity, for its angle of approach. We can then calculate how much energy is released during that particular impact. right? And then we can then conjecture about the consequences. We can say, okay, it's going to release a fireball. There's going to be X amount of material, volume of material injected into the atmosphere. There's going to be fallback material, what we call fallback breccia, is going to come back to the Earth, perhaps start secondary fires. What happens, though, if it's 100 impacts or more? Do you see how suddenly it gets so complicated? That what happens if we have meteors falling into a forested area where there can be huge forest fires generated, as let's say falling into an arid area like a desert where there's not the forests, right? We know from Tunguska that about 200 square miles of the impact zone was incinerated, right? We know about 820 miles were affected by the blast wave and knocked down something like 800 and some square miles of old growth taiga forest was utterly flat, right? What happens over the oceans? What happens over if they're in an Arctic zone? What would happen, and this is a question that's intrigued me for a long time, what would happen over an ice sheet? Let's say you had a encounter during the depths of an ice age when large swaths of the Earth's surface are covered in ice, right? Well, you can see right here, if the Earth encounters a swarm like this, like we're seeing in this image right here, this swarm could be actually many times the size of the Earth itself. Now, if the Earth is passing through this, we might be looking at periods where you have clustered bombardment. And given the scale of this swarm, it could be affecting, and depending on how quickly the Earth crossed through the stream, it could have enormous consequences that would be very, very difficult to model, right? I think this might be one of the things that we're going to have to be thinking about. And when we start looking at the ancient traditions, which we're about to do in a minute, I think you'll see that there is some amazing correlations between some of the visions and prophecies and accounts that have come down to us through these various venues, actually in a religious context, which we have to assume could certainly be plausible, that experiences and people witnessing these things and surviving encounters like this. Think about what happened with the single event of Tunguska. It spawned a new religion, didn't it? Remember we talked about that? Agni, the fire god that descended to the earth, and according to the Tungusi tribal beliefs now, that event triggered the emergence of a new religion. And Agni, the fire god, was punishing them for their transgressions and so on, right? So if one single object, an event like a Tunguska object, could spawn a religion, a religious response, what about 10 or 100? Should we assume otherwise, that it wouldn't? Okay, we're not going to get into this now. We're going to talk about this later, probably in the next episode, the 5 stages in the life cycle of a comet. But very briefly, aggregation is the hibernation, activation, disintegration, and amalgamation. Okay, so let's go on here, and I'm going to just zip on through. Tunguska, we talked about this. I'm not going to, reiterate all of this. Just maybe a quick refresher. We went through this material already, so please go back and review this in order to get that maximum depth of understanding. I don't think we went through all of the accounts, but we did enough that I think you got the gist of it, the kinds of things. The underlying parts here, what we're going to focus on here, was too bright for the naked eye. And it had a bluish white light. Now that's interesting in terms of what we just saw with a lot of cometary nuclei. The tails are bluish. There's a reason for that. It moved vertically downwards for about 10 minutes. The body was in the form of a pipe, cylindrical. Now, I remember my grandfather, who was a boy in Sweden, used to tell a story to me and my brothers when we were little about something that he saw. And I remember it made kind of an impression on me when he would tell that story and I would puzzle over it. He said it was at night. He was out walking next to a lake and a big, like, blazing pipe. He saw it in the sky and it fell down into the lake. And I had no idea at that time what in the hell he was even to what you saw looked like a blazing pipe. I had no concept of what he was even talking about. But of course, later on now, I figured he probably saw a major encounter of a bolide. Now, it may or may not have actually fallen in the lake that he was next to. I don't remember enough details from his story. But one of the common phenomena is that people witnessing fireballs, major fireballs, is they give the illusion of being much, much closer than they actually are. In fact, I got some stories here, people like there was a cowboy who saw one night. He was out on his horse, and and of course it came over, it was many miles over his head, but he literally thought it was about to hit him, and he ducked down in the saddle on his horse. So we'll just go through here. All the inhabitants of the village ran out. This was probably Vanavera. The old women wept. Everyone thought the end of the world was approaching. This is something that we find over and over again in these cosmic events, people thinking that it's the end of the world. So right there you can see end of the world. Well, what does that do? Well, it obviously invokes the picture of apocalypse and what happens. And the traditions of the end of the world. Let's go on here. This I may not have mentioned, but this is an interesting point. The flight and fall of the meteorite on the 30th of June, 1908, amongst the greatest meteoric phenomena known to mankind, must occupy one of the foremost places because of the magnitude of the phenomena accompanying its movement through the atmosphere. It is unlikely, now this is written in 34, it is unlikely that our generation may again be witnesses of a similar meteoric phenomena. However, as it says here, if it had occurred 4 hours and 47 minutes later, when the city of Leningrad would have lain on the same parallel near the center of the explosion, our knowledge of it would probably have been considerably more extensive. And also the implications for history would have been very different. If a major city of the world had been annihilated back in 1908, might have changed the perspective. Who knows? Maybe World War I never would have happened. I would like to mention that one of our original sponsors at Cosmographia, CBD from the Gods, is following us here to our new podcast, Squaring the Circle. As many of you know, I've been using their products for going on 4 years now, and having tried a number of CBD brands, CBD from the Gods seems the most effective for my needs, which is primarily as a sleep aid and as a remedy for inflammation and associated pain. I use both the oil and the salve. My wife also likes their products, especially the salve, which alleviates the pain in her hands, which is the result of working for years as an electrician. If you've been thinking about trying a CBD product and experiencing the benefits for yourself, give CBD from the Gods a try. To learn more and see their product line, check out cbdfromthegods.com. Any purchase of their products helps our efforts here at Squaring the Circle to realize our goal of making this world a better place. Thanks. So this was from an account in a newspaper that came out on July 13th, published right there in Siberia, and describes an extraordinary atmospheric phenomena, a noise as a strong wind. Right? This is very interesting metaphor here. The noise as a strong wind. Of course, it's more than a metaphor because they heard this sound. And it was followed immediately by a fearful crash accompanied by a subterranean shock which caused buildings to tremble. One had the impression that some huge beam or heavy stone had possibly struck the building. This was followed by two further equally forceful blows. So then there was followed by between 50 and 60 bangs becoming gradually fainter. During all this time, the ground is trembling. Okay. And then, as eyewitnesses relate, before the first bangs were heard, a heavenly body of fiery appearance cut across the sky from south to north, inclined to the northeast. Inclined, okay? An incline. This is important. Neither its size nor shape could be made out owing to its speed and particularly its unexpectedness. And part of that, again, as we talked about, that unexpectedness is it was coming from the direction of the sun. Now, this is important in trying to get a sense of the identity of this cosmic visitor, because it was coming from the direction of space, precisely where one would expect a member of the Taurid meteor family of objects to be coming from. It also came during precisely the time of year when the Earth is crossing the Taurid meteor stream. So those two factors together make a strong circumstantial case that the Tunguska cosmic object was a part of the Taurid family. So here, this is another interesting metaphor here, the way it's described. Many people in different villages distinctly saw that when the flying object touched the horizon, a huge flame shot up that cut the sky in two. Okay, I want you to be trying to visualize this as we're going through this. And we've already gone through this, so I'm going to skip a lot of it. So the glow was so strong that it was reflected in rooms whose windows faced the south. Faced the north, because these villages are to the south of the site of the explosion. Apparently, the glow continued for at least a minute, since many peasants in the field noticed it as well. Bangs were heard as soon as the tongue of flame disappeared. So we can see that the visual impression precedes the audio impression, because the sound wave has taken, if we're Vanavera here, I think we're 20 to 30 miles. Probably this encounter is 20 to 30 miles away from the blast, the area of the blast. On the island opposite the village, horses began to whinny, and cows to low and run wildly about. One had the impression that the earth was just about to gape open and everything would be swallowed up in the abyss. Again, important descriptive metaphor. Okay. Fearful bangs resounded from somewhere, shaking the earth, and the invisibility of the source inspired a kind of superstitious terror. People were literally dumbfounded. And then from another newspaper account, a mighty noise was heard, resolving into thunder cracks, although the sky was cloudless at the time. The noise caused houses to shake. Many inhabitants saw a fiery body like a beam. So here we get this analogy of a beam once again. It shot from south to northwest above the ground before they heard the thunder. Immediately afterwards, the bang was heard, and in the place where the fiery body had disappeared, a tongue of fire appeared, and this was followed by smoke. And then Vasily Akhchen, he was one of the Evenki people who gave his testimony to Krinov, who was one of the scientists that went and collected a lot of the eyewitness accounts. So he was sleeping in his tent when suddenly his tent was just torn away and he was thrown aside. And then the ground shook. There was incredibly loud, prolonged roaring. And then everything roundabout was shrouded in smoke and fog from the burning trees. Eventually, the roar died away, the wind dropped, but then the forest went on burning. So other accounts, the children of Evinak Hodiga camped on the river Avargita. So they were awakened by a loud rumble Explosions were heard everywhere. The earth trembled and there was a loud cracking noise. What was this cracking noise? Well, it was probably plasma discharges, is what my thought was. But then this was followed by what they describe as a terrible storm, during which they could hardly keep on their feet. And this terrible storm flattened the forest near their tent, and far away towards the north, there was a kind of a cloud that rose up. And then this was the testimony of Semenov, also given to Krinov, while he was collecting eyewitness accounts in 1930. So he was sitting on the porch of his house in the village, which was a trading station of Vanavara, and at breakfast time, and he happened to be looking toward the north, and he was going to hoop a cask. So he says he raised his axe. I guess he was going to open a cask of something, when suddenly, in the north, the sky was split in two, and high above the forest, the whole northern part of the sky appeared to be covered completely with fire. At that moment, he says, I felt great heat, as if my shirt had caught fire. I wanted to pull off my shirt and throw it away, but at that moment there was a loud bang in the sky, and a mighty crash was heard. I was thrown to the ground about 3 sageans away, which would be about 20 to 25 feet, from the porch, and for a moment I lost consciousness. My wife ran out and carried me into the hut. The crash was followed by a noise like stones falling from the sky, or guns firing. The earth trembled, and when I lay on the ground, I covered my head because I was afraid that the stones might hit it. At the moment when the sky opened, a hot wind, as from a cannon, blew past the huts from the north. Then we have the tale of Marfa Bryukhanova. She was 19 when the meteorite fell, and she was at the trading station of Vanavara. She had gone to a spring for water, and as she began to draw the water, she was standing beside, so her friend was Marfa, and this was the testimony of Semenov's daughter, Kasalapova. So she went out to draw water with her friend Marfa. So Marfa began to draw the water, and Kosalapova was standing beside her, facing north. Then she says, suddenly, before me, I saw the sky in the north open to the ground, and fire poured out. We were terrified, but then the sky closed again, and immediately afterwards, bangs like loud gunshots were heard. We thought that stones were falling from the sky and rushed off in terror, leaving our pail by the spring. I ran with my head down and covered because I was afraid that stones might fall on it. When we reached the house, we saw my father Semenov lying unconscious near the barn, opposite the porch of the house. Marfa and I carried him into the hut. We were terribly frightened at the time. The fire was brighter than the sun. During the bangs, the earth and the huts trembled greatly, and the noises at first were very loud and seemed to be right above our heads. Well, the explosion, of course, is 25 miles away, or maybe even more. But yet the impression they had was that stones were falling. They're ducking because they think these stones are going to fall and hit them in the head. So this is from a letter that Kulik received 1935 through 1936 by a certain Naumenko from the village of Kezhma. And so he's describing how it was in the morning. The day was unusually clear. Not a single cloud was to be seen. No wind stirred, and there was absolute silence. Suddenly, far off, still, hardly audible, was heard the sound of thunder. Made us look up involuntarily in every direction. The sound seemed to come from beyond the river Angara, And then it became louder and louder rapidly. There was something extraordinary about it. The first fairly faint crash resounded, but when I turned quickly in the direction of the crash, I saw that the sun's rays were crossed by a broad, fiery white band on the right side of its rays. On the left side, towards the north, an irregularly shaped, brilliantly white, somewhat elongated mass was flying into the taiga with a diameter far greater than the moon's. Approximately 2 to 3 seconds, maybe more, after the first faint crash, a second, louder crash of thunder resounded, as loud as that generally heard during a storm. After the second crash, the ball was no longer visible, but its tail, or rather the streamer, was now completely on the left side of the sun's rays. Then, after a shorter interval of time than that between the first and second crashes, the third thunder crash occurred. This was so loud, as though there were several crashes all mingled together within it, that the whole ground trembled. An echo, like a continuous, deafening roar, resounded through the taiga. Indeed, it seemed through the whole taiga of vast Siberia. The carpenters, after the first and second crashes, had crossed themselves in stupefaction. And when the third crash resounded, they fell backwards from the building onto the chips of wood. Some of them were so stunned and utterly terrified that I had to calm them down and reassure them. We all abandoned work and went into the village. There, whole crowds of local inhabitants were gathered in the streets in terror, talking about the phenomena. And then, from another account, we see this was one Kokorin who was sailing down the river Angara. In the north, a pale bluish light glowed, and from the south, a fiery body that was considerably larger than the sun left a broad, bright streamer behind as it flew across the sky. Then such a cannonade broke out that all the workmen who were in the boat rushed to hide in the cabin, forgetting all about the danger that threatened from the rapids. The first bangs were faint but became progressively louder. The sound effect, he estimated, lasted 3 to 5 minutes. The intensity of the sounds was so great that the boatmen were completely demoralized. Then we have that a large group of local inhabitants say they first noticed a ball of fire in the north, coming down obliquely to the horizon from east to west. When it approached the ground, it changed into, important symbol, a pillar of fire. After its disappearance, a cloud of smoke was seen rising upwards from the ground. A few minutes later, a loud noise was heard with separate deafening crashes like peals of thunder. These crashes were followed by 8 loud bangs like gunshots. The first bang was exceptionally loud and accompanied by a whistling noise. So I think you get the impression. Here the Tungus people wandering beyond the hamlet of Nizhny Karalinsk say that the thunder was terrible. So many of these accounts. Now, the reason I'm going over this and reiterating is because I want you to get these impressions in your mind. I want you to get these pictures, which is being described here. Go a couple more. On the 17th of June, now this is because it's an older calendar that was used. The 17th of June in the older calendar corresponds to June 30th of the Gregorian calendar, okay? At 7:15 a.m. in the northwest, a pillar of fire appeared in the shape of a spear. Okay, so here's another emblem, another symbol that we're going to learn is frequently attributed to these kinds of events. When people are struggling to try to fit these kinds of events that are, for the most part, completely outside the experience, the human experience, they're looking for anything they can to try to describe what they're experiencing and what they're seeing, okay? So it becomes very valuable to look at the imagery that they invoke, the symbols that they invoke, right? Because we can now use that to go back, look at more traditional and ancient accounts, and to see those ancient accounts in a different light, in a different perspective, okay? So a pillar of fire appeared in the shape of a spear. So we're going to go look a little bit, and I'll give you an idea of where we're going this and where we will go to, where we're headed to for the next episode. So I'm going to read a verse from the Armenian Apocalypse of Daniel, which goes back to into the first few centuries BC. And as I'm reading some of these, I want you to keep this imagery of Tunguska in mind. And what we've just learned, and what we've learned over the last 10 episodes of this apocalyptic phenomena. So here's how it reads. Then shall the sun be darkened, and the moon changed to blood. The stars shall fall down like leaves, and the heaven shall be rolled up like a scroll, and all things shall be scorched and parched by the wind. Fiery angels shall come down from heaven, and fire shall flare up throughout the whole world. Let's look at a verse from the 8th chapter of the book of Revelation. And the angel took the censer. You know, a censer is what the high priest is, the burning the burning coals or the burning incense. Thank you. The burning incense. And this is what the angel is taking. This is, again, a metaphor here. The angel took the censer, filled it with fire of the altar, and cast it into the earth. And there followed hail. Now think about hail. Hail and fire mingled with blood. Now this correlation with blood, again, is something we're going to come back to, because this association and correlation with blood we find occurring many times, and there's a reason for that. So there followed hail and fire mingled with blood, and they were cast upon the earth, and the third part of the trees was burnt up, and all green grass was burnt up. Now here's from Psalms 18th chapter. Then the earth shook and trembled. The foundations also of the hills moved and were shaken. There went up a smoke out of his nostrils, and fire out of his mouth devoured. Coals were kindled by it. He bowed the heavens also and came down, and darkness was under his feet. He made darkness his secret place, and the brightness that was before him, his thick clouds passed, hailstones and coals of fire. Then from the 2nd chapter of the book of Acts. And suddenly there came a sound from heaven as of a rushing mighty wind, and it filled all the house where they were sitting. And there appeared unto them cloven tongues like as of fire, and it sat upon each of them. And when this noise was noised abroad, the multitude came together and were confounded. Sounds a little familiar, doesn't it? Then from the 1 Kings, 19th chapter. And behold, the Lord passed by, and a great and strong wind rent the mountains and break in pieces the rocks before the Lord. And after the wind, an earthquake, and after the earthquake, a fire. Interestingly sequenced. A great and strong wind, an earthquake, and a fire. Where have we seen this sequence? Again, second chapter of Acts. And it shall come to pass in the last days, saith God, I will pour out my spirit upon all flesh, and I will shew wonders in heaven above and signs in the earth beneath, blood and fire, and vapor of smoke. The sun shall be turned into darkness, and the moon into blood. Sixth chapter of Revelation, the book of Revelation. And I beheld, when he had opened the sixth seal, and lo, there was a great earthquake, and the sun became black as sackcloth of hair, and the moon became as blood. And the stars of heaven fell unto earth, even as a fig tree casteth her untimely figs when she is shaken of a mighty wind. And the heaven departed as a scroll when it is rolled together, and every mountain and island were moved out of their places. From the 76th chapter of Psalms. The waters saw thee, O God, the waters saw thee, they were afraid. The depths also were troubled. The clouds poured out water, the skies sent out a sound. Thine arrows went abroad. The voice of thy thunder was in the heaven. The lightnings lightened the world. The earth trembled and shook. Now, we know that there can be plasma phenomena associated with cosmic impacts manifesting as lightning bolts. So I find all of this now very interesting, and I hope that you, the listener here, finds this interesting in the light of what we've learned in these episodes. So now I'm going to just quickly go through. I'm going to set up side by side so that you can see a comparison of some of the quotes from the eyewitnesses and survivors of the Tunguska event and some of the accounts, which I am suggesting are actually eyewitness accounts, that these accounts that appear in scripture and in prophecy and so on are actually inspired by eyewitness accounts of celestial phenomena. We'll go back. Let's side-by-side comparison. Psalms 18. Scriptural testimony. Then the earth shook and trembled. The foundations also of the hills moved and were shaken. Now from Tunguska. The earth and the huts trembled greatly. The ground shook. An incredibly loud, prolonged roaring was heard. Everything round about was shrouded in smoke and fog. So here, interestingly, even the same words are used. Here's our scriptural testimony. And the Lord also thundered in the heavens, hailstones and coals of fire. The voice of thy thunder was in the heaven. The lightnings lightened the world. The earth trembled and shook. Then from Tunguska, suddenly far off was heard the sound of thunder. There was something extraordinary about it. The intensity of the sounds was so great that the boatmen were completely demoralized. This was so loud, as though there were several crashes all mingled together within it, that the whole ground trembled. The ground shook. An incredibly loud, prolonged roaring was heard. Deafening crashes like peals of thunder, and the thunder was terrible. So, thunder was common, both the whatever spawned these scriptural accounts and the eyewitness of the Tunguska survivors. Scriptural testimony, the Lord passed by in a great and strong wind, rent the mountains, And suddenly there came a sound from heaven as of a rushing mighty wind, the Tunguska testimony. Then a noise like a strong wind was heard. Our scriptural testimony. Thou shalt be visited of the Lord of hosts with thunder and with earthquake, and a great noise, with storm and tempest, and the flame of devouring fire, from the prophet Isaiah. Now let's look at Tunguska testimony for comparison. They were awakened by a loud rumble. Explosions were heard everywhere. The earth trembled and there was a loud cracking noise, a terrible storm during which they could hardly keep on their feet, flattened the forest. And then that, of course, was followed by a flame of devouring fire. So our scriptural testimony. And there appeared unto them cloven tongues like as of fire. Now, the word cloven, which shows in the Bible in the King James Version, means literally to be split or divided, okay? So there appeared unto them cloven tongues like as of fire. Now our Tunguska testimony. A huge cloud of black smoke was formed and a loud crash. All the buildings shook, and at the same time a forked tongue of flame broke through the cloud. Next, quote, a ball of fire in the northwest coming down obliquely. When it approached the ground, it changed into a pillar of fire. After its disappearance, a cloud of smoke was seen rising from the ground. Next quote, suddenly in the north, the sky was split in two, and high above the forest, the whole northern part of the sky appeared to be covered in fire. Many inhabitants saw a fiery like a beam, body like a beam, shoot from south to northwest. Before they heard the thunder, and immediately after the bang was heard, a tongue of fire appeared, followed by smoke. Now notice, it's described as a tongue of fire. What do we have up here? Cloven tongues, like as of fire. Our scriptural testimony from Acts 26 chapter. At midday, O king, I saw in the way a light from heaven, above the brightness of the sun, shining round about me and them which journeyed with me. And then the basic English Bible actually says, on the road I saw a light from heaven, brighter than the sun. Here's the Tunguska testimony. The peasants saw a body shining very brightly, too bright for the naked eye. Next quote, we were terribly frightened at the time. The fire was brighter than the sun. A fiery body that was considerably larger than the sun, and an elongated body narrowing towards one end and torn, as it were, from the sun. Its head was as bright as the sun. From back to our scriptural testimony, the sky was split apart like a scroll when it is rolled up. That's from the book of Revelations. From the Syriac apocalypse of Peter, we have, and fire shall eat into the earth from above. The light of the sun and moon shall grow dark. The stars be scattered and fall down, and the heaven rolled up like a sheet of paper. From the Armenian apocalypse of Daniel, the stars shall fall down like leaves, and heaven shall be rolled up like a scroll. Now let's look at the Tunguska testimony. However, many people in different villages distinctly saw that when the flying object touched the horizon, a huge flame shot up that cut the sky in two. Suddenly before me, I saw the sky in the north open to the ground and fire pour out. We were terrified, but the sky closed again. At the moment when the sky opened, a hot wind as from a cannon blew past the huts from the north. And the final quote, when suddenly in the north the sky was split in two. Now, go back, look at here. The sky was split apart like a scroll. Scriptural testimony. And the fifth angel, and this is again from the book of Revelation, and the fifth angel sounded, and I saw a star fall from heaven unto the earth. I think they're telling us here literally, people. And to him was given the key of the bottomless pit, And he opened the bottomless pit, and there arose a smoke out of the pit as the smoke of a great furnace. He could actually be talking there about a piece of a object, a meteorite, actually striking the ground. Then we have the Tunguska testimony, an extraordinary underground roar like the sound of a number of trains passing simultaneously over rails. And then one had the impression that the earth was just about to gape open and everything would be swallowed up in the abyss. Now, it's very interesting that people not only experienced the atmospheric and the celestial component of this, but they also experienced the subterranean component of this, which was just as impressive to them. From our scriptural testimony, Acts, 2nd chapter, now when this was noised abroad, the multitude came together and were confounded. Then from the Tunguska testimony, all the inhabitants of the village ran out into the street in panic. The old women wept. Everyone thought that the end of the world was approaching. And whole crowds of local inhabitants were gathered in the streets in terror, talking about the phenomena. And finally, the phenomena inspired a kind of superstitious terror, and people were literally dumbfounded. People were literally dumbfounded, and here the people came together and were confounded. Scriptural testimony. Then shall fall the stars from heaven, the moon shall be hid, and no light be in it, the light of the sun shall be suppressed. This is from the Pseudo-Johannine Apocalypse. Then we have from the Ethiopic Apocalypse of Peter, and the sun shall suffer eclipse, and the moon become blood, and the stars fall from heaven through the greatness of God's wrath. And then the Syriac Apocalypse of Peter, fire shall eat into the earth from above, the light of the sun and moon shall grow dark, the stars be scattered and fall down. Now let's look at our scientific testimony by contrast. This was from a paper, Evolution of an Impact-Generated Dust Cloud and Its Effects on the Atmosphere, which was published in the Geological Society of America Special Papers. We have simulated, quote, we have simulated the evolution of an optically thick dust cloud in the Earth's atmosphere, and have also calculated the effects such a dust cloud would have both on the amount of visible light reaching the surface, visible light reaching the surface. Okay. Then from the Journal of the Theoretical and Applied Climatology, we have this. This is the chronology of dry fogs in Italy. The presence out of season of unusual persistent fogs, which were preceded or followed by a weak sun, a red sun, or a red moon. Get this, the sun and moon surrounded by bloody halos. So this is something now that has actually been documented, to have actually been witnessed by peoples throughout history, very similar phenomena. And then we see the scriptural testimony, and here it is. I think it's right. I think it's just telling us unequivocally what's going on here. Then shall the sun be darkened and the moon changed to blood. The stars shall fall down like leaves. And this is what we know in the aftermath of an impact and the great fires and the dust in the atmosphere is that the sun is darkened and the moon can become very red. Now, this ancient testimony here is referring to historical records from the period 536 AD, which I'm going to be talking about when we get into discussing the inner significance of the Grail mythology. But here we see from Procopius, the sun gave forth its light without brightness. Now he's describing what people are witnessing in 536 AD. The sun gave forth its light without brightness, like the moon, during the whole year, and it seemed exceedingly like the sun in eclipse. And again, the sun was dark, and its darkness lasted for 18 months. Each day it shone for about 4 hours, and still this light was only a feeble shadow. Now, here's the thing. In a series of impact events, you're going to have the injection of a large amount of soot, dust, particulate matter into the atmosphere that could take months, even to a year or two, to finally clear out. During this time, yes, the sun can become darkened. Literally, the moon can become as blood. Then from the Armenian apocalypse of Daniel, scriptural testimony tells us that fiery angels shall come down from heaven, and fire shall flare up throughout the whole world. Well, here I think we may have another symbol, another metaphor. Fiery angels shall come down from heaven, and fire shall flare up throughout the whole world. Now, here's what scientific testimony says. Recent studies have shown that a host of fair-sized pieces could have more devastating global consequences than a single winter-causing object by igniting many separate conflagrations that merge into a global firestorm. I would submit to you to consider that these are two different ways of describing exactly the same phenomenon, each using the symbology and the terminology of its own discipline, its own scientific understanding of the world and these events. Finally, we have the angel took the censer and filled it with fire of the altar and cast it into the earth. And the third part of the trees was burnt up and all the green grass. That's from 8th chapter of Revelation. And then we go down to the scientific testimony, and we discover now that there is evidence for extraordinary biomass burning. Here was a particular episode and an impact winter triggered by the Younger Dryas cosmic impact 12,800 years ago. And then the ice record is consistent with the Younger Dryas boundary impact theory. Extensive impact-related biomass burning triggered the abrupt onset of an impact winter. And again, the fiery angels coming down from heaven, and fire shall flare up throughout the whole world. And then from Peter Tyson, Comet Busters, article appeared in Technology Review. Recent studies have shown that a host of fair-sized pieces could have more devastating global consequences than a single winter-causing object, by igniting many separate conflagrations that merge into a global firestorm. Now, is this not basically saying the same thing, that the fiery angel coming down from heaven, fire shall flare up throughout the whole world? And here we have many separate pieces emerging into a conflagration, many separate conflagrations that merge into a global firestorm. And then, as we get to the end here, an important implication of this picture is that smaller, Tunguska-like fragments of comets will be concentrated in clusters or swarms. This is from a very important book, The Origin of Comets, by Victor Klube and Bill Napier, came out in 1990. Some contemporary fireball-producing meteoroids approach the Earth in streams. This is very important. This is, as I was talking about earlier, the idea that we might have clustered bombardment and that we're limiting, constricting our thinking if we confine it only to the single impact event. So some contemporary fireball-producing meteorites approach the Earth in streams. And then from the article, An H. Chondrite Stream, Identification and Confirmation, we read that clearly the existence of streams of Earth-approaching meteoroids also has implications for calculations of the likelihood of life-threatening impacts on our planet. Now we have from the ancient testimony, in the words of Plato, after the usual interval, the stream from heaven, like a pestilence, comes pouring down. Could that be the kind of stream he's talking about? From the book of Psalms, the waters saw thee, O God, the waters saw thee, they were afraid, the depths also were troubled, the clouds poured out water, the skies sent out sound, thine arrows also went abroad, the voice of thy thunder was in the heaven, the lightnings lightened the world, the earth trembled and shook. Now look at here, the waters were afraid, the depths also were troubled. What does this suggest to you? The depths of what waters? The clouds poured out water. The sky sent out a sound. Arrows, again, another symbol for the impacts. Okay, now let's consider. The waters saw thee, the depths were troubled. I would submit the possibility that were references to an oceanic bolide impact. The clouds poured out water. Well, that's obviously going to happen because you're going to have a massive injection of water vapor into the atmosphere, and that's going to cause your rain out. And I think we're going to pause here, and we're going to pick it up in the next episode with the story of the fall of Phaeton, which Plato, in his dialogue to Timaeus, references and obviously gives it a great deal of importance and significance because he references it as a preface to his discussion of the story of Atlantis. So we are going to end this episode here in our series on the apocalypse unsealed. We will soon be back with another episode, and we will pick up the storyline with the fall of Phaeton, and we will look at the importance of that particular myth to the ancient Greeks and why Plato chose to preface his story of Atlantis with a reference to the myth of Phaeton. Thank you. Hope you enjoyed this. I'll see you next episode.